Awesome, fantastic. Thanks everyone for coming. If you took a look at your program and you saw there was a talk of FHIR for product management, that's actually not happening, but this talk is also about product management, so you may want to stick around. But if you were looking forward to the folks from Athena talking about FHIR for product management, I won't be insulted if you run out of the door right now. All right, you had your chance to leave. You're in here now. It's nice to meet everyone. My name is Mark Olschesky, and I'm Chief Data Officer at Datica. I'll tell you a bit about our company, but I've been in healthcare IT for about 13 years, doing everything. I started at Epic, founded a startup in healthcare technology, and for the last 5 years, I've been helping our customers with data integration problems with my team at Datica. And I'm here today to talk about what it takes to implement FHIR, some of the challenges, but mostly to encourage you that if you work in a multi-product or a multi-business organization, to consider using FHIR for your own internal development purposes, and how we've seen success with that with projects that we've worked on at our company. A quick overview of Datica, maybe just to establish how we've gained the background on this topic. The goal of Datica is to bring healthcare to the cloud. So we have 3 products that help our customers build compliant applications, high trust, GDPR, HIPAA. But we also have a platform that manages data integration with our customers on top of that platform. And that's the team which I run at Datica. We work with customers all across healthcare, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, traditional healthcare IT vendors, hospital systems, payers, you name it. We work with customers across the entirety of the industry, which is really amazing because our company is only about 6 years old. The team I run and the product that I run is a product called Compliant Managed Integration. So a process to help our customers exchange data securely with any EHR in a scalable fashion. My team's gotten a lot of work done over the last few years where we've helped our customers connect into over 300 health systems. We process millions of messages across our products daily. We've never failed a security assessment. I always like to knock on wood at this point is that we've had 0 unexpected downtime, 3 years in a row and counting. And the thing that I'm most proud about is that we've managed to build this mostly with open source technology. So it's very easy to do this with DIY components to be able to build yourself. It's interesting being able to do this talk, following speakers from the ONC and Mickey, who's worked with the Argonaut project, where we just talked a lot about interoperability, where it's very interesting where, in places, and we're all here kind of for the cheerleading of FHIR, but in a lot of articles you'll read things where people will openly question, is FHIR ready for the prime time? Can you use FHIR successfully within an organization or within a product and have it be useful for you, to have it actually generate outcomes within your product? Some people would say that it's about time. DSTU2 was in draft standard in 2014, officially passed in 2015. So we've had it for roughly about 4 years now. And some folks are wondering if it's going to make hay or if it's going to solve the kind of problems that the folks who have been cheerleading it for said that it would. And there's been a lot of folks who have cast doubt on it. These were just a sampling of blog posts that I was able to find out there. There's challenges with FHIR. Is it here to stay? Is it ready for implementation yet? Somebody, and if you're in the audience, I'd love to talk with you about this, compared the implementation of FHIR with the episode of Trouble with Tribbles in Star Trek. There's a lot of folks who are really curious, can you begin using FHIR today? Is it something that you should begin investing technology on? Greg Grieve, when he was up here earlier today talking about FHIR R5, discussed how a good interoperability standard needs to be able to support 4 major data protocols. It needs to be able to allow its consumers to be able to read data, to be able to write data into an EHR or an HIS system. It needs to be able to support pushing data, similar to an ADT feed today, where it can push admissions or discharge updates to a customer. And finally, allow applications the ability to subscribe to those resources. You probably saw a version of the spreadsheet if you were just at Mickey's talk, but we're not quite there yet from an interoperability standpoint with the resources of FHIR. You can see for a lot of very common resources, you may be able to query data, but you may not be able to write across all vendors. You may not have the ability to stream data across all customers. There's a lot of things that externally, if you're working with the major EHR or HIS vendors, you may not be able to do yet. And so you'll hear a lot of talk similar to those blog posts that I just posted that basically indicates an argument along the lines of, well, if FHIR doesn't support all of your use cases everywhere, then it's useless. If FHIR can't do everything for you, why even bother putting any kind of endeavor or any kind of experimentation into it? Now you're here today, you came here for FHIR DevDays, so your organization obviously believes that you should at least investigate putting some effort or some implementation into FHIR. But there's a lot of organizations out there and a lot of people and a lot of writers who are trying to throw FUD into the entirety of this equation. And it reminds me a bit of organizations who have really put a lot of effort into older data standards, folks who have a lot of technology around HL7 v2 or managing CDAs, or folks that really want to maintain the status quo, kind of like Smeagol hanging on to the ring. Who really say, like, why do we ever need to change anything? Everything we got is fine. Why would we want to do anything else? And there's a lot of motivation to not break free from that, to not try and innovate on how interoperability really works, to just keep trying to put better layers onto the way things that currently works. But I don't think that's right, because I don't think anybody's really happy with the way that interoperability works today. Again, I think that's why we're all here. So, we've been working on FHIR at Datica for over 4 years. And I can tell you outright that FHIR isn't going to solve all your interoperability needs in 2019 for getting data to and from EHR and HIS systems. It's a long way out. You still may need some help with something like HL7 v2, CDA formatted documents, ETL processes. We're a long way out from FHIR being able to solve all of your problems. But what's really interesting to me is that there's something that's not getting quite as much press and not quite as much coverage, is that FHIR's capabilities to really power interoperability within an organization or within a product organization. To me, FHIR is a very good way to standardize your internal requirements, or as we may refer to it as interoperability, even if it doesn't solve your external data needs. And I think this is especially true if your organization has multiple entities. So if you're a business that has multiple businesses that's grown over the course of acquisition or just plain organizational politics, or if you have disparate product teams with non-shared databases. So if whenever a new product team wants to build something else, you don't build it all on the same shared database with something like Epic. And what's interesting, we've encouraged our customers to investigate using this, to begin starting with FHIR to begin applications. But what's very interesting to me is that independently, healthcare organizations have begun doing this themselves over the last 4 years too, since R2 was released back in 2015. So if you're in good company, if you're trying to do this, one of the world's largest medical device companies have centralized all of their clinical data on FHIR. One of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies has centralized all of their clinical data on FHIR. Some of the most connected healthcare IT vendors that have been in the market for over 30 years have centralized all of their new applications on FHIR. Even one of the largest software companies in the world, like Microsoft, is building new applications for utilization in healthcare with Microsoft Teams and Dynamics, is centralizing on FHIR. So don't take it from me. These organizations think that it's a good idea too, centralizing their data around clinical data around FHIR for new applications. So now that I have told you all of these things, the question is why? Why should you use FHIR? Why should you use something that's not entirely built in-house to build clinical data standards around within your organization? The first thing, and I think this is really almost the biggest part of it if you work at a really big product organization, is it de-politicizes parts of the product design process. And I've built an application from scratch And let's just run through a product example of object design where if you weren't going to use FHIR, the first thing that you would need to do is you would need to define a schema, or you need to design an object for what does a patient look like, right? This is like your core clinical backbone of pretty much every basic application. You have a patient that is your core box, you put data into the patient box, or you attach things to each other. And so if we're sitting around and we say, well, a patient has a first name, it has a middle name, it has a last name, they need to have some kind of identifier, they need to have a date of birth, people have a gender, and we need for our application, we're gonna text message them, so we need a primary phone number. And that works for application number 1 at our company, right? Tale as old as time. We put the stamp on it, we write the database table for it, and we keep going. But there's a lot of questions within this schema that you need to handle from a product standpoint. How many of each name should we support? What happens if people have multiple first names, multiple middle names? How many identifiers should you support? How many medical record numbers can you have? Should you create different records if people have different medical record numbers? How should you handle timestamps, Unix timestamps, ISO 8601 timestamps? What gender identifications are supported? Do we not care about multiple contact types? Do we? And that's fine. You know, again, if you just have one application, you could probably determine all of these things as justified as you want to or absolutely arbitrarily, and you could just come back and you could clean up technical debt as you needed to improve this. But if you have 2 applications, this can get pretty complicated pretty quickly, where if another application determined they wanted to handle name differently, medical record number differently, timestamps differently, the way you would classify gender, contacts, like all of these things can get really disorganized really quickly if you haven't standardized on applications internally. And then if you have 8 applications or 10 applications or 20 applications all trying to do things with the same kind of data, this can get really out of hand quickly. The thing that I find this happens with the most is when we work with medical device companies, or if we work with companies that are generating what would traditionally be known as observations or medications, you know, your kind of greatest hits, is that everybody has invented their own data model for representing an observation. And so if you try and, even for something that's relatively consistent like heart rate or blood pressure, that there's just no way to consolidate this across different products. And so if you use FHIR internally to be able to standardize around those data models, you no longer need to worry which product gets to decide what's right, what's wrong, how are we going to manage this within a healthcare within our organization and within our products. A patient is the FHIR patient data model with any extensions not otherwise covered by the FHIR spec for that specific resource. The second thing that I can tell you about FHIR that I think is really impressive and the community's really revolved around, and many of you in this room might have contributed to making these things, is that FHIR provides a lot of solid tooling that works out of the box with a low initial cost. You know, if you were trying to aggregate a pile of health data in the past, you might have to go to somebody and you might have to cut them a check for a large amount of money up front just to get in the door to try and do something with clinical health data. Now, it's not saying that there isn't value in something like that, but in 2019, a lot of healthcare developers really want to get started with something fast and easy to be able to define data, aggregate data, and then do things with it, business intelligence, APIs, applications, you name it. And the power of FHIR is that with tools like FHIR, the Azure API for FHIR, I went to a great data modeling session early today using a product called ClinFHIR to be able to model data and be able to use it for testing FHIR data standards. There's so much great tooling that you don't have to start from scratch, like if you would if you built your own data models to define a patient or define an observation. The next thing that I think is really a great pitch for FHIR, especially if you have a multi-product or a multi-business organization, is that it's a relatively easy path to manage enterprise topics like ACLs and de-identification by restricting or removing sensitive resources. So if you have one business entity that's gathering a large amount of data, let's say they directly are receiving everything that has to do with a surgical case, and you have a contract that allows them to give de-identified data to another business unit, If you didn't have something like FHIR, you would have to come up with those rules of engagement, whereas using something like FHIR, you can either move data to another FHIR server, you can use ACLs or de-identification by access to FHIR to restrict or remove access to those sensitive resources. Again, it's not that this is impossible if you don't use FHIR, but there is a pretty good path to be able to do this. And then the fourth thing is that FHIR is going to happen eventually as we go back to that slide of where more vendors, more EHR systems, more HIS systems are supporting the entirety of the FHIR spec, read, write, streaming, subscriptions. If you're already using FHIR, you already support a lot of what it takes to be able to support it, versus if you have your own internal data models, you're always going to be building connectors for disparate FHIR resources. And so we've worked with our customers to build a lot of infrastructure like this across disparate healthcare organizations, where you're receiving a lot of different data from EHR systems and HIS systems via HL7, via ETL, via the CDA, your traditional bread and butter healthcare data formats at the moment in time, transforming it using a tool like NextGen Connect or Mule. It doesn't really matter, you just need something good and consistent to transform that data. But then pushing the data using FHIR to either a traditional data store, a FHIR server that already has out-of-the-box support for something like subscriptions so that you don't have to implement access control to data in the future and give them the ability to query it, or even just take FHIR resources and push it into object storage like something like an S3 bucket or Azure Blob, so that if you want to build some kind of data lake in the future and if you're not sure what you're going to do with the data but you want to do something with it later, like these are all things that you get out of the box using a modern data format like FHIR, standardizing around FHIR as a data model. Any questions on this? There's a lot of things that we've gone through here. I don't know if we have a microphone runner specifically. Any questions? If there's not, then we'll go into lessons learned on some of the work that we've done. Yes?
Can EHR jumping directly to the data store without setting up
At some point in the future, yes. At some point when EHRs support the subscription push and bulk data implementation to FHIR, they will, right? Like the dream is that at some point in the future that you don't need this data transformation layer to get stuff done and to make your products work. But it's 2019, so when FHIR is not fully implemented, the only things that you can control really and you can FHIRify entirely are on the right side of the fence, things that are entirely within your business or things that are entirely within your organization. But in the future, that black box fades away and you have access to be able to do things with FHIR, but you don't need to be able to transform it, or you don't need to do as heavy of a transformation as you do with ETL or HL7 or CDA, where you really need a lot of technology to make something like that work. I would say like non-determinant data reporting. So I mean, there's a lot of tools, with like something like a data lake where it's non-structured, but if you have enough of a consistent data type within it, so if you had a folder entirely of patient resources, you'd be able to query JSON objects to determine how many people are within a certain date of birth or how many people have a blood pressure within a certain range without having to insert it specifically into a structured data thing. So if you know what to do with data and you have ideas of what the queries are going to be, a structured data store makes a lot of sense. Whereas if you're not sure what you're going to do with the data quite yet, you can keep it in object storage and you can always have some kind of a stored procedure or some kind of data migration later to be able to make sense out of that data. Well, yes. The FHIR server means that it already has all of the structure of FHIR based on top of it. It has APIs, it has access controls, like it's a fully functioning data server. It's basically a mini EHR versus a database doesn't have that. You have to build APIs on top of it. You have to figure out your own way to do it. But I mean, we've worked with customers that have wanted to do different things with FHIR, with all of these different things. And at some point in the future, if there's more support for BI tools on top of FHIR server, maybe you don't need a data store, maybe you don't need object storage. But right now, a lot of our customers today don't just store FHIR information that they're generating or that they're translating in one location. They're putting it in different places to use different tool sets in order to either analyze the data or expose it to applications. Great, those are great questions. I really appreciate it. All right, on to lessons learned. So we've been doing this for a while, helping our customers understand this. And these are a few things that I've learned about working with FHIR, especially at a larger organization, that I want to be able to share with you if you're going to bring FHIR back to your organizations, how to better evangelize internally within your own company. The first, and this isn't necessarily to say that anyone doesn't necessarily know things, but this is really complicated, and this is probably about 70% of friction that I've seen with FHIR revolves around something like this, is that if you don't understand how the FHIR modeling works, maybe you're wrong. And being able to teach people within your organization just how complicated health data can be. I feel fortunate. I was brought up in this healthcare IT world at a traditional EHR vendor. And it's hard to explain to people that the reason why some of the data modeling works either is because of underlying laws or business processes, or this is just the way that we design these systems. But a lot of folks, if you weren't using something like FHIR, would make their own assumptions with data modeling versus actually operating based upon the way the data modeling actually works. And this is the most classic example that I can think of, which a lot of folks miss. I've had to go through this with 5 individual customers giving some version of this talk. So we're going to do a quick pop quiz. You have an application, you have a product. How do you determine what insurance a patient has? What is the object relational model between that? And if you talk to a lot of folks, most people would tell you that it looks like this. A patient has insurance. Getting some shaking nose of things. Who thinks it's a bit more complicated than this? Getting some hands, it's all right. Yeah, no, it's way more complicated than that. Where in fact the way, at least in the United States, but other countries have their own billing requirements that tie more into episodes of care and other more complicated objects. It's not quite as simple to assume that a patient has one insurance. This isn't a 1-to-1 type ratio whenever you're talking about patients, where it's actually something more like this, where you have a coverage object, and a patient may have multiple coverages, you may have multiple forms of insurance, you may have something like Medicare and some rider on top of that with a traditional payer like Aetna. You have an account, which is a box to be able to indicate that this was your coverage. An account can span across multiple encounters. So you may, for an inpatient visit, you may go see the cath lab. That might be 2 different EHR encounters, but it might be 1 different account. And those all tie up to you as the patient. And this is the kind of thing which, understanding some of these things, I can explain to people. But people say, well, we could just build our own data model that goes back to this. Why don't we just make it this straightforward? This seems like it's a lot of hassle. Well, because it actually is really that complicated, right? You can always start with a more simple abstraction of what data looks like, but you're eventually going to reach the edge cases that expose that within your application, and you're going to have to just solve it again later. You're always going to be deferring technical debt into the future if you don't solve these problems up front. And the nice thing about FHIR is that a bunch of really smart, hardworking people have done a lot of the brain power for that for you. So again, you may not necessarily understand some of the rationale. Why does the ordinality work this way? Why do the object references work this way? But if you go through it, You can always hop on the FHIR Zulip. You can always interact with the work groups. If you want to know the rationale, you can find out what it is, and it may not be perfect. You know, I mean, that's why we don't have just one version of FHIR. You know, it's why we've had 4 and we're going on 5. But it's because health data modeling actually can be this complicated. And if you don't necessarily have some of the expertise or some of the background in knowing how it works, being able to rely on people already doing it really helps. The second thing, and this was very interesting to me, you know, again, coming from EMR world, is don't assume everyone knows the current state of EHRs or healthcare information systems in your vertical and what they can do in their data capabilities. I worked on a project where we were going to aggregate some larger amount of clinical data to drive efficiencies within hospitals. And the first thing that we realized was that no one realized that health data was digitized well in the United States of America. And so for about 3 months, we gave what was known as a roadshow across multiple business lines of an organization, telling people, this is what an EHR does. This is some of the information that's in it. Did you know that in the year 2007, in the United States, the government put around $30 billion in order to incentivize physicians to use EHRs, and it worked? There's a lot of things which people, you know, again, this is probably a very HIT-centric crowd, so we might get these things a bit more, but other folks might not necessarily understand quite as well. The third thing that I can think of, and we've come across this a few different times, you know, and the FHIR spec has a very opinionated topic on this, but I think it leaves a lot up to you as the implementer, is that FHIR delegates identifier management to you. It basically says you can figure out how to identify patients however you want to, or you can just drop a patient into the store and you can let us come up with an identifier for it. But that doesn't really come up with a clean rules of the road of how you should let people insert or create new patients within your FHIR data stores. You can create, if you wanted to post a patient resource into a data store, like our Catalyze apps one here, you don't have to include an identifier. You can let the FHIR server create an identifier that goes in. Is that a good idea? Not necessarily. Should you require your developers to be able to look up, make sure they're ensuring that there isn't duplication of patients from a same data source before they push it into the system? These are the kind of things you should consider. These are the kind of things we've built technology for at Datica to help our customers to make sure that there are some rules for the road for developers as you're working with FHIR data stores. Because again, the biggest problem that you could have is creating duplicates, which you then need to deduplicate. I always like to end a good presentation with a nice picture of my dog, who's having a pretty good time. You may want to be outside where he is right now, but I'd like to answer any questions you have about using FHIR at a large organization, building new applications with FHIR, standardizing things with FHIR. But otherwise, I appreciate you coming.
Have you faced any problem with technology mapping? If yes, how did you solve it?
That's a really good question. I mean, we've worked with other vendors that have made terminology mapping tools. I mean, it's not necessarily a first-class citizen of FHIR itself. You know, we've worked with vendors like IMO, Wolters Kluwer provide terminology services when we've built things in there. We're not a terminology services company ourselves. We don't make a terminology mapping product. So we've always relied on products to do that. But I think one of the things that we've always needed to do was educate our customers on, again, if you, not all teams that are doing things with FHIR have a strong background in clinical informatics. So they may think, oh, it's very easy to define all the disease states that are diabetes. It's not. It's hard. Is it easy to know which medications are anticoagulants and keep that up to date? It's not. So being able to guide your customers or be able to guide your product towards the tools that you need for terminologies are the kind of things that we've done for our customers of, this is how you could build it, this is how you could buy it, this is what we recommend based upon what you're trying to do. But it's a challenge. You know, again, I think FHIR was right to try and not get too into the weeds with it, but it's something that you may need to figure out or you may be able to provide references to as you're trying to complete a product like this. Up in the front.
Yeah, so our biomedical research side. And I think it makes a whole lot of sense when you're in the pure healthcare side of FHIR. We get a lot of friction about like, well, we need to interface things with mouse models or cell lines and kind of, so from that perspective, like, have you met use cases where does it kind of, where's the boundary that you find that maybe you leave the health system, and have you encountered that at all?
Yeah, I mean, we've segmented some FHIR data for biomedical research. I mean, that's been a big part of what we've done in the medical device space. But I think it's worth noting that, I mean, at least in the forms that they are, FHIR may not work for everything. You may need to extend it. You may need to do something else with it. But, I mean, again, you should, as you're working with your own stakeholders, determine if FHIR is a good fit for what you're trying to do. And I think the one thing that's still a bit rough is cohort segmentation within FHIR, at least with a lot of the standard tools that are out there. And that's why we had different data stores there outside of just FHIR servers, where if you only care about specific data points, maybe being able to isolate certain fields that you're looking for and storing them in a different format makes sense. Where you have FHIR, which you would expose to other application developers who care about the pure clinical health data parts of things. But if you need to extract something for health data, at least as we've done it, just not being entirely dogmatic to FHIR itself, making sure that if there's something else that solves the problem better, either a better database scheme, a better tool, something else that receives data in a different input. And again, I think FHIR is going to get there at some point, but like your problem isn't solving problems in 2025. Like your problems are solving things today. So knowing where, if you feel like the current implementation isn't helping you, documenting that, letting people know, but not feeling like you have to stay within that. Like even our customers that are 100% trying to model everything about FHIR know that it's not going to work for all they're trying to do in their organization.
Two questions. The first one is for identifier management. What are some of the best practices that you've seen? And the second question is, what's the name of your dog?
This is Scout. He has an Instagram. It's Scout_out. I think he also has a Twitter account. He's a very delightful husky. I live in Wisconsin, so he doesn't enjoy that it's summer right now. I don't enjoy that it's winter 8 months a year. So very important. When it comes to identifier management, I think it's good when you're taking a look at FHIR resources for them to be ultimately human readable. So instead of just arbitrarily posting identifiers or allowing the FHIR server to create a resource, adding metadata to the ID tag. Again, it shouldn't be a medical record number. It shouldn't be anything that's wholly static. But having it be something where you can identify where this came from, what was an ID in the source system that you may be able to do some forensics on in the future, and where were we putting it, or what do we intend on doing it within the identifier, helps a whole lot, especially if in the future, if you plan on enable population health type querying, where give me every patient with a date of birth within this range, or give me everyone who has this condition. When you start doing larger type queries, being able to know, like, if you have data that you're aggregating from so many sources, like where did this actually come from? Being able to do that while looking directly at a FHIR resource versus having to do forensics on the outside of things, I've really found to be pretty helpful, and our customers have too.
What's your experience with existing internally data organizations, not all existing applications, not all existing data sources, right? And so to migrate them to this approach, as well as a two-part question. Secondly, looking at the adoption in the industry, you see a lot of read-only resources available. So
Right.
is this more of creating an additional data source where you're saying that the same data is now available for read-only in a separate data store?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, like here's an example. So like let's say you're a medical device company, and one business within your organization wants to know a feed of surgical scheduling feed in an organization to be able to reasonably anticipate demand. One business finds that important. The HL7v2 SIU spec, they find value in like 11 of the fields of the 190 field set. But the second business might find something value in 20 more of the fields. The third business might find something there. The fourth business might find value if you took that surgical scheduling feed and you combined it with observations, conditions, allergies, medications, et cetera. Like the point is that even though FHIR itself is going to be limited to be able to query out of EHR systems, that if you transform everything to FHIR and you tell these different products, instead of me writing an API to push it into application number one, me to write an API to push it, like instead of having to support all these different legacy applications, everybody else just needs to support FHIR. This is the only way it can happen, or this is the only way it can get done. Otherwise, we're just going to get bogged down in the operational, I was going to say hell, operational hell that it takes to, like, in order to get 12 different businesses to do something versus saying somebody else thought this was a good idea, you should do it. Far in the back.
On the topic of identity management and duplication, if you have multiple systems that don't share common identifiers, let's say your HR system or EHR, they don't share common network logic, for instance. Do you have a technique or a strategy that you recommend for doing that duplication or relating to the same providers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, we haven't had to roll out a complete MPI solution yet for any of our customers. I mean, we have very few customers that are trying to do cross-organizational patient identification. You know, it could definitely be a challenge. I mean, MPI management can either be as simple as running a basic algorithm or running a basic calculation across patient metadata to determine it's a dupe to something that, you know, the government tried to award $1 million prize and quit when they realized no one was really getting close towards doing patient deduplication. I mean, it could be a very challenging problem if you live in a country that has a national patient identifier, something that's globally applicable that you're allowed to use for aggregation purposes. Obviously, something like that's easier. But for our customers, it's always been about right-sizing the solution. I mean, the only strategy that I've come up is not prematurely optimizing for it. You know, making sure that you have the right identification, de-identification strategy at your right point of your product, where I think a lot of organizations think that they're going to have to track patients across different organizations up front, where realistically it might be years until you get to that point, and you can always build a system on top of what you have versus it's something where you might, like if you don't do it correctly up front, you may never be able to undo it.
A lot of your talks seem premised on adoption in large organizations. Do you see a lot of adoption in small orgs as well?
Yeah, I mean, we've had this, I mean, we have customers from startups to large organizations. I mean, a lot of these things apply, you know, again, it's all the question of when tech or organizational debt is really going to catch up to you, right? Where if you're, you know, we're not a large company, we have about 50 people at it, you know, technical debt doesn't bite you immediately. Like you could very easily come up with something very quick year one. Again, FHIR is a pragmatic way to store data, build things. The one thing that I've always found ironic, you know, we have about, I'd say like 70 customers that are startups, is that everybody starts doing the exact same thing, where everybody basically builds a mini EHR. Again, what does a patient look like? What does a condition look like? What does an observation look like? And everybody defines these terms wholly on their own. Whereas if you just start by using something like a FHIR server, you could hypothetically skip some decent chunk of that. Like again, you need to know what your goals are, what your outcomes are, and what you really need to optimize for. And at some point, you'll reach some, you know, basically a breaking point if you didn't prematurely optimize too much building up front, where the solution you came up with might not necessarily work. But the nice thing about me for FHIR for startups is that, again, it de-democratizes the entirety of the process. Like that patient mapping exercise I went in the beginning, like startups have that problem too. Instead of saying, what should a patient look like? When you're a startup, you've definitely got more important things to do. Instead of just going, well, let's just use the FHIR spec. If we realize there's something that doesn't classify it very well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Yeah, that's a really good question. We tried to build our own FHIR data store. So we took a Postgres database, we put FHIR APIs on top of it, and immediately upon releasing it, R3 of FHIR was released. And even though DSTU2 was around, suddenly we had just a ton of work on top of this custom data store that we had built to be able to support it. And that's why I would recommend using one of the publicly available, or not publicly available, like one of the options for FHIR aggregation or FHIR servers that's available, Vonk, the Azure API for FHIR, Happy FHIR, the Google Healthcare Cloud API. I think I called it the right thing. So many of these companies are putting a lot of effort into FHIR, which is awesome, around a lot of the logistics of how it'll work. Because that's not going to be your product unless you're here, like some of you probably are here, like trying to build the best FHIR server. But if your goal is to improve care coordination or build a telemedicine product or improve patient outreach, like how your FHIR server work doesn't really matter. And that's what we realized, is that we built a FHIR data store, and then we realized, oh, like Happy FHIR is already 9 steps ahead of us. Microsoft has 20 people working on this. Google has 10 people working on this. And it was just really hard for us to keep up. So relying on those projects and those products instead of trying to invent the wheel entirely from scratch ourselves.
So when you did that, did you ever have times where the FHIR extension framework with the profiles and extensions, like, it didn't quite meet your needs, and then you found like you have better access to like the source code, and now you don't, because you're like using the reference implementation that you don't
Yeah. The only time, it's interesting, across all customers we have, like very rarely has FHIR not met our purposes. And every time we have, it's been with DSTU2 and financial, like organizational information, which if you're using more recent versions of FHIR, it's much more well organized. But some organizations have wholly focused on DSTU2. And so that diagram that I had of coverages accounts, that entire chain of how patient billing works is much less defined. And so, I mean, we would come up with extensions for it. But for the most part, a lot of our customers really use pretty vanilla FHIR. The places where we've had to do some things a bit differently are been in verticals where they have their own specific FHIR profile, like the quick specification for FHIR, which is used in clinical decision support systems. Awesome. Well, I think it's about that time, or if anything, I'm running a bit over. I appreciate everybody coming. Thanks. Feel free to grab me outside if you have any questions.